Leslie had no plans to return home that morning. The day was reserved for celebrating Monica's birthday, the woman she had called Mom her entire life. She was already wearing the outfit she had chosen the night before, carrying a gift wrapped in gold paper and thinking about the menu for the family lunch. Traffic was unusually light, allowing her to arrive ahead of schedule at the intersection where she was to turn into the restaurant. It was there, as the light turned red, that she remembered she had left her spare car keys on the dresser in her bedroom. Under normal circumstances, she would have ignored them, but Antonio would need them later to take his car in for a service. She turned the wheel and drove home, little imagining that those few minutes would change the course of her life. When she opened the front door, the first thing she noticed was a strange silence. It wasn't the usual silence of an empty house, but a heavy one, as if the walls were holding air. She climbed the stairs slowly, listening for every creak in the wood. It was then that she heard Antonio's voice. She thought he was on the phone, but she immediately recognized another, softer tone between his words. The voice of Vanessa, her twin sister. Her heart leaped. She continued walking until she stood next to her bedroom door, which was half open. What she saw made her immediately nauseous. Antonio and Vanessa, in her bed, wrapped in the sheets she had changed the night before. Before she could turn away, she heard her name followed by phrases that stopped her in her tracks. Will, letters, and she's not who she thinks she is. Leslie backed away carefully, as if simply making a sound might worsen something already irreparable. She felt a ringing in her ears, a mixture of adrenaline and suppressed rage. There was no room for an immediate confrontation. She didn't want to give them the chance to make excuses. She went down the stairs with cold hands and a racing pulse, grabbed the keys she'd come for and got out, closing the door with the gentleness of someone trying to erase her presence. In the car, she stood for a few seconds without starting it, staring at the steering wheel, trying to understand if what she'd heard was real or an impossible misunderstanding. She made the drive to the restaurant on autopilot. The city seemed oblivious to her storm. Traffic lights changing, people crossing streets, a delivery man whistling as he carried a box. Everything was normal outside, but inside Leslie, everything was broken. She parked in front of the restaurant and took a deep breath, forcing herself to compose a neutral face. She couldn't arrive a mess, not in the middle of a family event where everyone would be watching. She walked in and was greeted by the bustle of conversation and the sound of glasses clinking. Monica was in the center of the long table, smiling with rehearsed elegance. Leslie greeted her, sat down opposite her, and, while pretending to be interested in the conversation of a distant cousin, planned how to introduce her question without arousing suspicion. Leslie backed away carefully, as if simply making a sound might worsen something already irreparable. She felt a ringing in her ears, a mixture of adrenaline and suppressed rage. There was no room for an immediate confrontation. She didn't want to give them the chance to make excuses. She went down the stairs with cold hands and a racing pulse, grabbed the keys she'd come for, and got out, closing the door with the gentleness of someone trying to erase her presence. In the car, she stood for a few seconds without starting it, staring at the steering wheel, trying to understand if what she'd heard was real or an impossible misunderstanding. She made the drive to the restaurant on autopilot. The city seemed oblivious to her storm. Traffic lights changing, people crossing streets, a delivery man whistling as he carried a box. Everything was normal. Outside, but inside Leslie, everything was broken. She parked in front of the restaurant and took a deep breath, forcing herself to compose a neutral face. She couldn't arrive a mess, not in the middle of a family event where everyone would be watching. She walked in and was greeted by the bustle of conversation and the sound of glasses clinking. Monica was in the center of the long table, smiling with rehearsed elegance. Leslie greeted her, sat down opposite her, and, while pretending to be interested in the conversation of a distant cousin, planned how to introduce her question without arousing suspicion. Monica didn't stop there. She lowered her voice slightly, as if wanting to keep what was happening between them, although the murmur from the rest of the table was loud enough to cover anything up. She admitted that there was an original will in which half of Franklin's inheritance belonged to Leslie. However, she had deliberately hidden that document and given everything to Vanessa. She justified this by saying she wanted to protect family harmony and avoid conflict. But in Leslie's eyes, those phrases were nothing more than hollow excuses to disguise theft. In that instant, Leslie felt the memories of her entire life reorganize in a different light. The childhood she had shared with Vanessa, the family celebrations, even the trivial arguments. Everything was now tinged with falsehood. Her mind jumped from one image to another. The first day of school, the birthdays when Monica dressed them all the same, the framed photos in the living room. All of this, which had once given her a sense of belonging, now seemed like an elaborate play, staged to keep her in the dark. That night, back home, Leslie felt the air was different, thicker, as if every corner knew what she had just discovered. She didn't turn on the hall lights and walked straight to the study. There stood her father's old chest, the one she had always seen as just another ornament. She took out the small key Franklin had given her years ago with the vague phrase, "in case you ever need it," and opened the lock. The smell of wood and old paper escaped suddenly, along with a strange feeling that she was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. Inside, she found neatly stacked documents, her real birth certificate, which listed Isabella as the mother, the original will granting her 50% of the inheritance, and a sheaf of letters written in Franklin's own hand. In them, he described Isabella as a kind, strong woman of Mexican descent who sang lullabies to her and dreamed of seeing her happy. He also admitted his cowardice in not standing up to Monica, warning that she might try to hide the truth. Leslie read each word with a mixture of relief and pain, as if those pages were simultaneously a hug and a condemnation. At dawn, Leslie called Carmen, her closest friend since college. Her voice was tense, but not broken. She had made the decision not to break down in front of anyone, at least not yet. She told her the essentials, the betrayal, the deception about her origins, and the existence of a hidden will. Carmen listened without interrupting, but in her silence it was clear she was processing the magnitude of what she was hearing. When Leslie finished, her response was blunt. "You can't leave it like that. This has to be proven, with them admitting it themselves." With that determination, they began to draw up a plan. They reviewed old contacts and sought out lawyers who had worked for Franklin and could confirm irregularities. That's how they located Robert Kellerman, a retired lawyer with a tired appearance and a deep voice, who agreed to meet with them at a secluded cafe. Leslie showed him copies of the documents, and after a long silence, Robert admitted to helping Monica manipulate the official reading of the will. That confession was like fitting the last piece of a painful puzzle. Not only was there family deception, but also legal complicity. Leslie knew that with that confession, she had a solid foundation, but she needed more. She decided to host a dinner party at her house, pretending her intention was to clear the air and heal wounds. She invited Monica, Vanessa, and Antonio, taking care of every detail to make it seem like a gesture of reconciliation. She set an impeccable table with the tableware she only used on special occasions, and discreetly placed a hidden recording device among the dining room decorations. She wanted every word recorded, with no possibility of denying it later. The evening began with tense smiles and superficial comments. Leslie initially avoided direct confrontations. Instead, she asked seemingly innocent questions, calculated to steer the conversation toward the necessary topics. Gradually, the discomfort became evident. Monica eventually admitted that Leslie was not her biological daughter. Vanessa acknowledged that the will had been altered, and Antonio, in a clumsy attempt to justify himself, hinted at his relationship with Vanessa. When the evening ended, Leslie locked herself in her room and listened to the entire recording. She felt not surprise, but cold satisfaction. Now, she had irrefutable proof. Days later, while sorting through a box of objects that Isabella's sister Rosa had kept for years, Leslie found something unexpected. A small key sewn into the lining of an old trunk. It was so discreet that anyone could have missed its presence. Number engraved on the metal gave her a clue, and after some digging, she discovered it belonged to a safe deposit box at a downtown bank. With the original documents she had recovered from Franklin's vault, she was able to gain access without any problems. Inside, she found a large, sealed envelope labeled with Isabella's name. Upon opening it, the first thing she saw were medical records showing that her mother had been in remission from cancer at the time of her death, completely contradicting the official story that she was ill and debilitated. There was also a report from an insurance investigator pointing to clear signs of sabotage in the braking system of the car she was traveling in. And, as a final blow, a handwritten letter from Isabella to Rosa, in which she recounted episodes of violence and infidelity on the part of Franklin, confessing that she was planning to run away with Leslie and that she feared for her life. With those documents in hand, Leslie went directly to the police. She presented everything: the medical records, the investigator's report, and Isabella's letter. The officers, seeing the coherence and weight of the evidence, authorized the reopening of the case and ordered the exhumation of the body. The procedure was swift and the results were conclusive. The brake system had been tampered with. What had been filed as an accident for years was now officially classified as a homicide. The investigation moved forward steadily. Monica was charged with fraud, conspiracy, and concealing a homicide, Vanessa with fraud, perjury, and conspiracy, and Antonio with fraud, conspiracy, and adultery. The news spread quickly, shattering the facade of a respectable family they had projected for years. However, before facing trial, Monica suffered a sudden heart attack that took her life. Vanessa was sentenced to 7 years in prison and Antonio to 5. Leslie felt no joy with the sentences, but she did feel a partial closure to a chapter that had marked her life with betrayals and deceit. In parallel with the criminal proceedings, Leslie filed a civil lawsuit to recover what was legally hers. She presented the original will, the recorded confessions, and all the documents proving the fraud committed against her. Vanessa and Antonio's lawyers attempted to halt the case with legal challenges and technicalities, but the strength of the evidence made it impossible to thwart the outcome. After months of hearings and legal maneuvering, the judge ruled that she should receive $400,000, which included the original value of the inheritance, plus interest and penalties for damages. With that money, Leslie decided to make a definitive change in her life. She bought a house in the neighborhood where Isabella had lived before marrying Franklin, a place where the street still held the stories and faces of yesteryear. The older neighbors remembered her mother and told her anecdotes that gave her back a part of her lost identity. She also began working for an NGO dedicated to helping people escape abusive relationships, both men and women. Every story she heard there reinforced the idea that her pain had found a purpose, to serve as a beacon for those seeking a way out. As the months passed, Leslie began to feel that she still had to close an important circle, tell her story. She didn't want to do it out of revenge or to fuel morbid curiosity, but so that others could identify signs of manipulation and abuse. Before it was too late, she sat down at her computer and began to write, chapter after chapter, reliving every detail. The betrayal, the lies, the evidence she had found, and the battles she had fought. The process was difficult but also liberating. With each page she completed, she felt like she was recovering a piece of herself. When she finally published the book, she didn't expect the impact it had. It became a bestseller within weeks, and Leslie began receiving hundreds of messages from people who saw themselves reflected in her story. Some thanked her for giving voice to their pain. Others asked for advice or simply shared their own experiences. It was in the midst of this turmoil that she received a call from Rosa, Isabella's sister, with whom she had spoken only by phone until then. Rosa suggested they meet in person, and Leslie accepted without hesitation, feeling it was another step toward reconnecting with her roots. The meeting with Rosa took place in a small cafe in the neighborhood where Isabella had grown up. When they met, no formal introductions were necessary. The embrace was long, silent, and charged with emotions neither of them had been able to express before. Rosa spoke to her about her mother with a love that transcended words. She told her how Isabella had a hearty laugh, how she stood up for what she considered right, and how she sang Mexican songs while she cooked. Leslie listened attentively, absorbing every detail as if she wanted to engrave it in her memory forever. That day, Rosa also gave her an album of old photos. Each page contained moments of Isabella's life that Leslie had never seen. Family celebrations, walks through the market, afternoons at the beach. It was like opening a window to a past that had been denied to her for decades. As she closed the album, Leslie felt a peace she hadn't experienced before. She finally had real pieces of her story, not versions fabricated to manipulate her. She left the cafe certain that her identity no longer depended on Monica's lies or Franklin's silences, but on the truth she had struggled to discover. 5 years after that day, everything came to light. Leslie visited the cemetery where Isabella's remains lay. She had a new headstone placed with an epitaph that read, "A courageous mother whose love transcended time and lies." She carried a bouquet of fresh flowers and lingered there much longer than she had planned. She didn't cry with the despair she had before. The tears that fell this time were soft, laden with relief and gratitude. She spoke softly, telling him everything that had changed since then, the battles won, the wounds that still hurt, and the choices she had made to honor her. Before leaving, she shared with Isabella some news she'd been saving for that moment. She was going to marry Miguel, Carmen's cousin and one of the lawyers who had accompanied her throughout the legal process. With him, she had found a different kind of peace, a relationship based on trust and respect, far from the shadows that had marked her past. As the sun set behind the tombstones, Leslie felt she was finally closing a cycle. She was no longer the woman trapped in a web of betrayal, but Leslie Santos Herbert, the owner of her story, proud of having transformed pain into purpose. Leslie left the cemetery with a feeling of lightness she hadn't felt in years, but also with a clear idea. She wanted to tie up every loose end that might still be weighing on her life. Over the next few weeks, she began sorting through documents, reviewing old folders, and organizing everything related to the case. She didn't do this out of obsession, but because she wanted to make sure nothing remained hidden, as had happened with the truth about Isabella. In the process, she found letters of gratitude from people who had read her book and, thanks to it, had made the decision to leave abusive relationships. These letters moved her deeply. There were testimonies from women who had mustered the courage to speak out, from men who had sought help to break cycles of violence, and from young people who recognized patterns of manipulation early on. Leslie kept them in a special box, as a reminder that her story had not only been a personal struggle, but also a tool that others could use to save themselves. This public response confirmed to her that her pain had not been in vain, and that the mark she was leaving was greater than she had imagined. A year after her engagement to Miguel, Leslie decided she wanted to celebrate her wedding differently. She didn't want a lavish affair or a ceremony designed to impress, but rather something intimate, surrounded only by the people who had proven themselves by her side through the toughest times. She chose a small garden in the same town where Isabella had grown up, a place with bougainvillea and stone benches that reminded her of the old photos in the album Rosa had given her. Every detail was designed to reflect their new beginning, from the soft music to the flowers that would decorate the tables. On the wedding day, as she was getting ready, Leslie felt like she was coming full circle. She wore a simple, understated dress and an antique brooch that had belonged to Isabella, borrowed from Rosa. As she walked down the makeshift aisle, she saw a mixture of pride and genuine emotion on the faces of those present. Miguel was waiting for her with a serene smile, and in that instant, Leslie understood that everything she had been through, every lie uncovered, every truth faced, had led her to that moment. It wasn't a fairy tale happy ending, but a real life she had learned to rebuild. After the wedding, Leslie and Miguel took a few days to disconnect from the noise and obligations. They chose a small coastal town, far from the big cities, where they could walk the cobblestone streets without being recognized. They spent the mornings having breakfast by the sea, and the afternoons exploring local markets, buying handicrafts and trying dishes they'd never eaten before. For Leslie, those days weren't just a honeymoon. They were a confirmation that she had learned to live without the constant shadow of betrayal and deceit. Upon returning, Leslie returned to her work at the NGO with more energy than ever. She began organizing in-person workshops, sharing not only her story but also practical tools so others could identify signs of emotional and financial abuse. Often, at the end of a talk, people would approach her with tears in their eyes, telling her that her testimony had given them strength. Leslie then understood that her purpose was not only to bring closure to her own past, but to accompany others in the process of opening their eyes and finding a way out. Over time, the NGO grew beyond what Leslie had imagined. It went from handling local cases to receiving requests for help from other regions and even abroad. To meet this demand, she organized a team of volunteers and professionals ready to offer legal advice, psychological support, and assistance in court proceedings. Leslie closely supervised everything, ensuring that each person received dignified and respectful treatment. One afternoon, while checking email in her office, she received a message that left her speechless for several minutes. It was from a young woman named Elena, who had read her book and recognized patterns in her story very similar to those of her own family. She said that thanks to Leslie, she had gathered evidence against those who had been manipulating her for years. That night, Leslie returned home feeling that her entire journey, from that day she returned for some keys to this present, had been worth it. Because not only had she saved her life, but she was helping to save many more. Months later, Leslie received an invitation to speak at a renowned university. The event was dedicated to real stories of empowerment and justice, and her name appeared alongside those of renowned activists and experts. At first, she hesitated. She didn't like to expose herself too much, but Miguel encouraged her by reminding her that every time she told her story, someone found the courage to take action. She decided to accept and prepared her talk with the same care she had used to write her book, without unnecessary embellishments, but with the truth as she had experienced it. On the day of the conference, the auditorium was packed. Leslie spoke for nearly an hour, recounting in detail how she uncovered the betrayal, how she gathered the evidence, and how she confronted those who tried to destroy her. There was no drama, but her steady tone and perfectly timed pauses kept the audience silent. At the end, she received a standing ovation. Among the attendees were law, psychology, and social work students, and several approached her afterward to tell her that her story had reaffirmed their calling to help others. With that experience, Leslie realized her voice could reach much further than she had imagined. She decided to create a series of traveling talks, visiting small communities and rural areas where many people lacked access to information about their rights or resources to escape abusive environments. In each location, she tailored her message to the context, listening to local stories and leaving practical materials so they knew where to turn for help. On one of those trips, while speaking to a group of women at a community center, an elderly woman approached her holding an old photo. To Leslie's surprise, the image showed Isabella, young and smiling, at a village fair. The woman told her they had been friends in their youth and remembered her strength and generosity. That moment reaffirmed for Leslie that her fight had not only been for legal justice, but also to rescue and honor her mother's memory, restoring her rightful place in family history. Over the years, the impact of her work began to be publicly recognized. She received awards from human rights organizations and was invited to collaborate on national campaigns against domestic violence and property abuse. While she valued these accolades, Leslie always reiterated that her true reward was seeing people emerge from seemingly impossible situations. In interviews and articles, she insisted that knowledge and support networks could change lives, just as they had in hers. At home, her life with Miguel was stable and mutual. They had learned to communicate freely, make decisions together, and enjoy the simple things like cooking together or taking walks around the neighborhood. Leslie knew there was no such thing as a perfect life, but she felt she had achieved something much more valuable: the ability to live in peace, without fear or secrets. On quiet nights, when she closed her eyes, she no longer relived scenes of betrayal. Instead, she thought of the grateful faces of the people she had helped, and how, somehow, Isabella continued to be with her every step. One spring afternoon, while organizing her desk, Leslie found a folder she hadn't opened in years. Inside were newspaper clippings about the case, copies of legal documents, and some photos from the trials. Looking through them, she felt a different weight. No longer pain or anger, but a kind of distance that only comes when wounds have healed. She decided to store those papers in a sealed box, not to forget them, but so they wouldn't take up any more space in her daily life. That same night, she spoke with Miguel about the possibility of taking a sabbatical. They wanted to travel without a fixed destination, see places they'd always dreamed of visiting, and at the same time bring their message to communities in other countries. Miguel smiled and told her it was the perfect time. Leslie understood that, although their story had been born of betrayal and pain, it was now hers to decide how to continue it. And this time, each new chapter would be written in freedom.